Hi everybody, tonight we begin a slow, wandering journey into a day in the life of someone who lived in the shadows of the medieval city's cobblestone streets. A woman whose work was both whispered about and sought after, whose survival depended on charm, caution, and an understanding of the human heart. It is not a tale of scandal, but one of quiet endurance, of seeing the world from behind half-closed shutters, and of how life can be both tender and harsh within the same hour. The city will be our backdrop, the sounds of hooves and bells our rhythm, and the candlelight our companion as we follow her steps from the first breath of dawn to the sigh of midnight. It was just before dawn when the first sound drifted in from the narrow lane below, the soft scrape of a broom along the worn stones, the faint clatter of a milk pail. In the dim light of her chamber, she lay still for a moment, letting the noises filter through the haze of half-sleep. Her room was small, the walls thick with centuries of smoke and laughter, the air faintly scented with last night's wine. A single candle had burned down to a waxy stump on the table by her bed, its flame long extinguished. She could hear the boards creak in the corridor outside. Someone else was awake, perhaps Agnes, heading downstairs to tend to the fire. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, feet brushing the chill floor. The city was cold in the mornings, even in summer, the stone holding on to the night's damp. Her dress from the previous evening hung across a chair, its bodice still creased where hurried hands had loosened the laces. She touched the fabric absently, not yet ready to move quickly. In the quiet moments before the day began in earnest, she liked to let her mind wander, to recall the faces of the strangers who had passed through her doorway, the laughter that had spilled across the table, the stories told in low voices over cups of ale. The house where she lived was 3 floors high, its beams darkened with age, leaning ever so slightly toward the street as if listening to the gossip below. The front room served as both tavern and meeting place, the air there always warm with the mingled scents of food, smoke, and humanity. Above, the chambers were smaller, more private, lit by narrow windows that offered a slice of sky and little else. It was not a life of luxury, but it was a life, and in the city, that was something to be guarded carefully. She pulled on a plain woolen shift, belted it loosely, and padded to the basin in the corner. The water was cold on her face, a sharp contrast to the sluggish warmth of her bed. Through the window, she could just see the first pale light brushing the rooftops, the spire of St. Agnes Church catching a faint gleam. Somewhere far off, a bell began to toll, slow, deliberate, marking the early hour when bakers lit their ovens and apprentices swept shop fronts clean. In the kitchen, Agnes was indeed at work, her sleeves rolled up, hair tied back with a strip of linen. She glanced up as the younger woman entered, her eyes sharp but not unkind. "You'll want something warm before you start," Agnes said, gesturing toward the hearth. A small pot of porridge simmered there, the steam carrying the smell of oats and honey. They ate together at the rough wooden table, not speaking much. The morning did not need words. It was enough to listen to the building waking around them. Somewhere upstairs, a door closed. On the stair, a laugh rang out, followed by the sound of boots descending. From outside came the occasional call of a street vendor, the bleat of a goat being herded toward the market square. Her first task was not to receive a visitor, but to go to the market herself. Work did not come only from behind closed doors. It lived in the way she carried herself through the streets, in the small glances exchanged, in the quiet conversations at stalls where spices were measured by the pinch and cloth by the ell. She wrapped a heavier shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the street, the air cool and damp. The city was already busy. Fishmongers set out their catch on beds of wet rushes, the silver scales flashing in the morning light. Bakers arranged loaves in neat rows, their crusts still warm. She moved slowly, greeting those she knew, the butcher's wife, who always gave her the smallest nod of recognition, and the apothecary's apprentice, who sometimes slipped her dried herbs without charge. It was in these morning walks that she gathered more than food. She gathered knowledge. Who was leaving town, who had returned, which merchants had struck a deal, and which had quarreled. Such information was as valuable as any coin, for her work depended not only on what she gave, but on what she knew. By the time she returned to the house, the tavern below was filling. Men from the docks with rough hands and salt-streaked hair leaned over mugs of ale, talking in low voices. A merchant in a fur-trimmed cloak sat alone by the fire, turning a ring on his finger as though weighing some decision. She slipped upstairs without drawing attention, knowing her presence could alter the room's mood before she had spoken a word. Upstairs, the bed was made, the candle replaced, the basin emptied. She took a moment to look in the small, tarnished mirror above the table. The glass was old, its surface warped, but it was enough to smooth her hair and straighten her shawl. Soon the day would begin in earnest, and with it, the delicate dance of smiles, secrets, and silences that was her trade. But for now, in this thin slice of morning, she allowed herself the smallest luxury, to stand at the window and watch the city breathe. The rooftops glowed faintly in the sun's first warmth, pigeons wheeled above the square, and somewhere, a boy's voice called out a greeting to the day. And in that quiet she thought, as she often did, that the city itself was alive, and she was merely one of its many beating hearts. By mid-morning, the light found its way more confidently into the narrow lane, turning puddles to small, bright coins and lifting the smells of yeast and river silt into the rooms like a tide. She left the window and unlatched the small chest at the foot of her bed. Inside were the tools that had quietly become part of her trade. A comb with 2 teeth missing, wrapped in a bit of linen to keep splinters from catching. A small vial of rosemary water from the apothecary's apprentice. A cluster of pins tied with thread. A rosary whose beads had been rubbed to a soft sheen. A pouch with enough coin to matter and not enough to tempt a thief. Each piece had a place, and touching them set her thoughts in order, as if she were tuning an instrument before a performance. Agnes knocked once and entered, a tray balanced on her hip. There was bread, shiny with a brush of egg, and a wedge of cheese wrapped in cloth to keep flies at bay. "You've a visitor after the bell," Agnes said, setting the tray down and studying the younger woman's face with that particular mix of care and calculation that ran the house so steadily. "Not a stranger. The barrel gilder with the pale hair brings a little blue ribbon for his daughter every time he comes." "The one with the cough?" she asked, tasting the bread's warmth before she swallowed. "The same. He says the river air makes it worse, but I think it's the sawdust in his shop. He'll want the back chamber, the one with the chair that doesn't wobble." She nodded. It was not an appointment in the strict sense. Nothing here was as formal as that. Yet people returned the way swallows do, to familiar eaves, drawn by habit and the simple mercy of being remembered. She wiped her fingers and lifted the small mirror to check for stray wisps of hair, then set it down and tied on her apron, not the one with the wine stain, the other neat enough to suggest order without pretending at finery. Downstairs, the tavern stretched and yawned into its daytime self. Light sifted through the shutters, striping tables and the backs of men leaning over cups. The merchant in the fur-trimmed cloak had gone, leaving only a circle of moisture on the wood and a few words in the air that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't heard the rest of the sentence. 2 boatmen argued softly about the price of hemp rope, their fingers drawing invisible knots on the table as if memory itself were a coil. The old blind fiddler in the corner tuned a string by touch and launched into a tune that had no beginning, only a gentle turning like a cartwheel in mud. She moved through it without disturbing the surface, stopping to ask if the fire was too hot for the man closest to it, if the ale had turned, if the lad carrying the trenchers had tied his apron properly. In this house, one learned to be seen but not felt until the moment called for it. It was a trick, but then the city thrummed with small tricks, how to step between rivals on the same street, how to make room for a donkey without catching your skirts, how to answer a question with a question when the asker stood in a constable's shadow. Agnes passed her a sprig of lavender from a jar near the hearth. "Put this in the pitcher upstairs," she said. "It sweetens the water and the temper." The back chamber was tidy as she'd left it. She set the sprig in the pitcher, let it bob and settle, and opened the shutters just wide enough to invite the light and not the attention. The chair that didn't wobble waited against the wall, and on the small table rested a single pewter cup and a folded cloth. She smoothed the edges, then sat for a moment to listen. The city outside, the fiddler's gentle drone, a hawker's call, rising and falling like a breath. She could tell the time often by the sounds alone. The bell of St. Agnes would ring the hour soon. The baker's boy would race past with a basket. The dogs would bark at nothing and be satisfied. When the gilder arrived, he stood just inside the door, as if uncertain which world he had entered. His hair did look pale in the half-light, not from age, but from a lifetime of sun on the river. He held his cap in both hands and coughed into the fabric, an apology and a reflex. She led him upstairs without ceremony, and the stair complained in the same two places it always did. In the chamber, he sat in the chair before she asked him to, the posture of a man who had decided his own comfort must be earned quickly or not at all. He put a small length of ribbon on the table, sky blue and crinkled where it had been wound around his finger. "For your girl," she said, and he nodded, cheeks coloring a little. "She's 5 now," he said. "Thinks the moon follows her when she walks." "They're clever at that age," she answered, pouring water into the cup and letting the lavender scent rise. "They think they invented everything." He laughed then, a low sound, surprised out of him like a bird startled from a beam. His cough returned, softer, and he took the cup in both hands and drank as if water were rare. They spoke of small things, which were precisely the right size for the hour. The guild's new dues, a neighbor who had lost a hen and found it 2 days later in her own chimney, the rumor that a bridge farther upriver needed repair before winter or else. She asked about his work, and he, pleased, explained how Goldleaf took to wood if one coaxed it and not if one commanded. He showed her his thumb and forefinger, which always carried a whisper of gold, no washing ever removed. When the bell rang, he flinched, then smiled at his own nerves. If there was a skill to her trade that no one saw, it was this, to hold another's dignity as gently and as surely as a cup filled to the brim. Not to spill it, not to gulp it, not to set it down in the wrong place. She had learned where to look and where not to, how to let silence do its part of the speaking. There were hours for flirtation and laughter. There were hours for a gentler kind of company, as serviceable as bread and as necessary. The city knew both existed and pretended to know only the first. When he left, a little calmer, he pressed 2 coins into her hand, more than last time, and asked for a prayer for his cough, as if she collected such things like stamps in a book. She said she would light a candle, and she meant it. The ribbon lay where he had put it, and she tucked it into a drawer that held small reliquaries of other lives, a button, a single chess piece, a dried sprig of thyme, a coin from a town she had never visited. Memory-liked objects. They kept stories from fraying. She washed the cup, changed the cloth, and stepped into the corridor, where the air felt cooler for a moment, as if the house itself had drawn a deep breath and let it go. On the stair, she met the apothecary's apprentice, his brown hair in disarray, his satchel thudding against his hip. "Your rosemary water," he said, lifting the flask with a flourish that would have looked more elegant if you weren't out of breath. "And, if you've any use for it, a bit of salve for chafed hands. My master says it's too simple to bother with, but simplicity suits more people than rare miracles do." She thanked him and gave him a coin and half a loaf wrapped in cloth. He looked as if he ate rarely sitting down. "They say," he blurted, then paused to collect his wayward thought, "they say there's talk of a new levy for houses like this. Not a law yet, a thought that's grown a root." "Thoughts with roots make bad weeds," she replied, not unkindly. "Tell me when it flowers." He promised he would, and thumped back down the stairs, nearly colliding with the fiddler, who steered him by the shoulders toward the door with more accuracy than sighted men mustered. Near noon, the house brimmed again. A pair of weavers with indigo-stained fingers traded grievances like cards. A young man in a patched cloak asked if anyone had seen a gray cat that answered to the name Bishop, which produced a dozen stories of cats who answered to no one. Through it all, she moved lightly, offering a cup, sharing a seat, setting a hand to a shoulder long enough to remind a visitor that he was welcome, and brief enough to let him keep his story to himself. She took her own meal in the little yard behind the house, where a pear tree leaned against the wall as if whispering secrets to the bricks. The pears would be ready in a week or 2, and Agnes had already spoken about tarts as if they were matters of policy. In the corner, A hen scrabbled for insects with single-minded dignity. She ate bread dipped in broth and a small apple, tart enough to tighten the jaw, and sat with her back against warm stone. Over the wall, the world pushed on. A cart rattled. A child sang a rhyme with all the seriousness of an oath. A bell near the Guildhall hammered noon into the air until it broke into silence. She closed her eyes and counted her coins by touch, not because she feared loss, but because knowing steadied her. 5 of copper, 3 of mixed, 1 of silver. Enough for rent, for food, for the candle she had promised to light, for the ribbon that would wait until a small hand reached for it. Enough to turn this day into tomorrow without begging for mercy from any man's mood. When she opened her eyes, the light had shifted, slanting into the yard and striking the low basin so that it shone like a small moon in daylight. She rose, brushed crumbs from her lap, and smoothed her apron as a sailor might smooth a chart before setting out again. The city, patient as an old nurse, waited on the other side of the door, full of needs and coins and stories not yet told. She stepped back into it, ready to let the hours arrange themselves in their gentle, ordinary procession. The afternoon opened like a slow fan, each rib revealing itself in turn. Sunlight slipped down the lane until it touched the tavern's threshold, and with it came the quieter kind of traffic. Merchants whose morning business had been concluded, travelers seeking a moment's rest before moving on, women from the dye houses with blue-stained wrists who came not to drink but to barter news for a cup of watered ale. The house seemed to breathe differently now. The morning's urgency had softened, replaced by the murmuring patience of the long middle hours. She moved among the tables with the practiced lightness of someone who understood the delicate balance between service and presence. Sometimes her task was simply to refill a cup before it was noticed to be empty, sometimes to catch the eye of a patron whose thoughts had drifted too far toward trouble. The fiddler had shifted to a softer tune, one that wove itself between conversations without ever demanding to be heard. By the hearth, 2 men from the tanner's yard were speaking in low tones about a debt owed to a man who had not been seen in the city for 3 months. They argued over whether his absence meant the debt had vanished or merely grown heavier. She did not linger, but their words followed her like a faint scent, another thread in the tapestry of whispers the city wove each day. In the far corner, a peddler sat with his pack open on the table, displaying ribbons, pins, combs, and the odd trinket whose origin he would not name. He smiled as she passed, lifting a small brooch shaped like a bird in flight. "From the coast," he said, "where the gulls cry like children lost in a crowd." She admired it, but her purse was light enough today that admiration would have to suffice. He did not seem offended. Such exchanges were part of the dance. Goods changed hands in this city as much for the pleasure of the conversation as for the coin. Agnes emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray laden with bread, cold meat, and a small crock of mustard. She set it down on the long table by the window, where a pair of clerks were bent over a ledger that seemed to contain the whole world in columns and sums. Without lifting their heads, they reached for the food, eating mechanically, as they discussed tariffs in a tone that might have been about the weather for all the passion it stirred. In the back chamber, she checked that the shutters were angled just so, letting in light enough to soften the room without turning it into a stage. A fresh cloth lay on the table, the lavender in the pitcher still fragrant from the morning. She had learned to keep these small rituals steady. People took comfort in rooms that greeted them the same way each time, as if the space itself remembered them. Shortly after the second bell past noon, a figure appeared at the door, a woman in a hooded cloak, the fabric travel-worn, dust at the hem. Her eyes swept the room, pausing only a moment before she stepped forward. There was a pause in the general hum, the way a room unconsciously adjusts itself to an unfamiliar presence. The woman spoke quietly to Agnes, who nodded toward the stair. Upstairs, the visitor removed her hood, revealing hair the color of chestnuts left too long in the sun. Her face was not young, though it held the kind of beauty that had nothing to do with smoothness, a beauty made of angles, of the deliberate way she moved, of the impression that she was accustomed to being listened to. She did not sit until invited, and even then she perched on the edge of the chair, her hands folded around a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. "You were recommended," she said simply, as if that explained her presence. Her voice carried a faint accent from somewhere to the south, where the hills were said to be covered in vineyards. She did not press for details. People came here for many reasons, and most of them were best learned slowly, if at all. She poured water into the cup, setting it within easy reach, and waited. The woman unfolded the bundle, revealing a length of pale silk embroidered with tiny green leaves. "It was my mother's," she said, tracing the edge with one finger. "I need it mended before the feast of St. Everard. There's no one I trust in the quarter where I'm lodged." This too was part of the work, to be a place where errands could be entrusted as safely as secrets. She examined the fabric, noting where the stitching had loosened. "There's a seamstress on Candlewick Street who can do it in 2 days," she said. "Tell her I sent you, and she'll match the thread without charging extra." The woman's shoulders eased, and she allowed herself a small sip from the cup. They spoke a little of the feast, the way the streets would be hung with banners, the stalls crowded with sweets, the church bells ringing from dawn until the torches were lit at night. For a while, the conversation drifted toward the weather in the southern hills, toward vineyards and the taste of early apples. It was as if the silk had been an offering to purchase a pocket of calm in the midst of travel. When the woman left, she placed a coin beside the cup, more than the advice was worth, but perhaps not more than the quiet. She touched the silk once more before tucking it away, as if leaving a fragment of herself behind. The afternoon lengthened. A boy arrived to deliver a message written in a crabbed hand on scrap parchment. She read it quickly, a request to reserve the back chamber for the following evening. No name, only a mark she recognized from past visits. She slid it beneath a small stack of such notes, each one a promise of work to come. Outside, the street grew busier again as the day's laborers returned from the docks, their boots heavy with the smell of the river. The sound of cartwheels over cobblestones mixed with the bray of a mule and the laughter of apprentices set free from their master's legs, eyes for the day. She leaned against the doorframe for a moment, watching the flow of people. There was a rhythm to it, the same every day, yet never quite the same. The faces, the voices, the small dramas playing out in gestures that most passers-by never noticed. Back inside, the tavern filled with a warmer light as the sun slid lower. The air thickened with the smell of roasting meat, with the sharper edge of ale being poured, with the faint perfume of a woman's hair as she passed by on her way upstairs. Somewhere in the middle of all this, she felt the first shadow of evening. Not darkness yet, but the knowledge that the city would soon change its shape, that the voices would grow louder, the streets more secretive, and that her work, in its own way, was only just beginning. As the sun began to lower, its light slanting gold across the beams, the air inside the tavern seemed to thicken, not with heat, but with expectation. The afternoon's languor gave way to a quiet readiness, as though the house itself anticipated the hours to come. Shadows lengthened in the corners, and the fiddler, without being asked, shifted to a tune with a little more sway in it, the kind that coaxed shoulders to loosen and conversation to grow warmer. She went upstairs to change. The day's plain apron and woolen shift were folded neatly on the chair, and from the small chest she drew a dress of deeper color, not ostentatious, but one that caught the candlelight in its folds. The bodice laced snug, the sleeves brushed her wrists, and the neckline dipped just enough to suggest without declaring. She pinned her hair in a way that let a few strands fall free. Such details, she had long learned, spoke their own language. From the window, she could see the lane gathering life for the evening. A pair of jugglers set up near the market gate, practicing in quick bursts before the crowd thickened. A man selling roasted chestnuts stoked his brazier until the smoke curled upward in fragrant ribbons. Women from the laundries hurried past with baskets, eager to be home before the streets grew too full. The city was not yet transformed, but the change was close, like the moment before the tide turns. Downstairs, Agnes was arranging the tables, pulling them just far enough apart to allow for privacy without giving the room a scattered look. She worked with the care of a steward arranging a feast, though the fare tonight would be no different from any other night. Bread, meat, ale, and the promise of warmth. "The Cooper's coming," she murmured without looking up, "and with him, two from the mason's yard. They'll want the corner by the fire." She nodded, taking a tray of cups to the bar. The fiddler gave her a small smile, his bow tracing an easy rhythm over the strings. In the far corner, the peddler from earlier in the day had returned, this time with his pack closed, as though he had come not to sell, but to watch. He nursed a cup of wine and listened to the talk around him, his eyes half-lidded, the way a cat might listen to the rustle of leaves. The first true patrons of the evening arrived just after the bell. The Cooper was a large man with a voice to match, though his laughter was kinder than his build suggested. The masons who followed him had the pale, dusted look of men who spent their days beneath half-built arches. They settled near the fire, boots stretched toward the warmth, voices rising and falling in easy rhythm. She brought them ale, accepted the Cooper's joke with a smile, and slipped away before the conversation demanded more than her presence. In the back chamber, she checked the lavender in the pitcher and lit the candles, their small flames bright against the growing dusk. The room felt different at this hour, not more intimate, but more deliberate, as if the air itself had been drawn closer. She straightened the chair, folded a fresh cloth for the table, and made sure the shutters were set to let the night's cool drift in without inviting the street's noise. A knock came at the frame, and one of the younger serving girls appeared. "There's a man asking for you," she said. Dark coat, hat in his hand, standing just inside the door. She went down, and there he was, not young, not old, with the air of someone who moved often between different worlds. His boots were well made but not new, his coat brushed free of dust, but worn at the cuffs. He inclined his head when he saw her, and without words she led him upstairs. In the chamber he did not sit immediately. Instead he walked to the window and stood looking out into the lane, where the light had turned the cobblestones to dull copper. "The city," he said after a pause, "is not so different from the sea. It has its own currents. You can drown in them if you're not careful." She did not answer, though only poured water into the cup and set it within reach. He turned at last and sat, placing a small parcel on the table. The paper was plain, tied with twine. "I need this kept for a week," he said. "It's not heavy, but it's worth more than it looks." Such requests were not unusual. She did not ask what was inside. In this business, the weight of a thing mattered less than the weight of knowing. She tucked the parcel into the chest at the foot of the bed, where it would join other temporary guests. A folded letter sealed in blue wax, a pouch that jingled too softly to be coins, a carved wooden box no larger than a man's fist. When she returned to the table, he had already taken a sip from the cup. His gaze was steady, not suspicious, but measuring, as though she were part of some larger calculation. They spoke little. A few words about the weather, a remark about the feast to come, the shared acknowledgement that the city was restless in small ways tonight. When he left, he placed a silver coin on the cloth and nodded once, as if sealing an agreement unspoken. By the time she descended again, the tavern was nearly full. Laughter mingled with the crackle of the fire, and the air was thick with the smells of bread, smoke, and the faint sweetness of chestnuts from the street. Agnes moved between tables with her usual quiet authority, and the younger girls darted in and out of the crowd like minnows in a stream. She carried a tray to the weavers, whose fingers were still faintly blue from their day's work, and lingered just long enough to hear them speak of a rumor that a new guildmaster might be chosen before winter. At another table, two travelers argued over whether the road south was passable after the last rains. A man by the door sang a fragment of a song that no one seemed to know, and the fiddler caught the melody, turning it into something new. Outside, the sky deepened, and the first torches were lit along the lane. The jugglers had gathered a small crowd, their bright scarves catching the firelight, while a pair of watchmen moved slowly past, their halberds gleaming in the glow. The night was taking shape now, and with it came the hours when her work, the careful tending of comfort, of trust, of the thin threads that connected lives in this quarter, would be most needed. The night came fully now, not in a rush, but in a slow claiming of corners and rafters. The last of the day's gold faded from the beams, replaced by the flicker of candlelight and the low, steady pulse of the hearth. Outside, the lane had taken on its nighttime voice, a mixture of laughter and muffled argument, the rattle of cartwheels over uneven stones, the occasional call from someone who knew exactly which window they wanted to reach. Inside, the tavern was alive in a different way than in the afternoon. The tables were no longer places to rest, but stages for small performances. A storyteller holding his listeners in the palm of his hand. A pair of gamblers leaning close over dice, their eyes bright with calculation. A mason tracing invisible arches in the air as he argued about the best way to brace a tower. Every table carried its own world, and each world was bordered by the steady rhythm of the fiddler's bow. She moved easily between these spaces, her presence shifting to match what was needed. A quiet hand refilling a cup, a brief word to smooth the tension between two men with voices rising, a shared laugh that dissolved a customer's unease. The skill lay in knowing when to linger and when to leave, in letting each patron believe they had her attention entirely, while never letting any one of them hold it too long. The back chamber was lit and ready, the lavender scent still faint but present. Tonight, it was for a man she had seen before, a clerk from the guild hall with ink-stained fingers and the habit of glancing toward the door as if each creak of the hinge might bring someone he knew. He arrived just after the third bell, carrying a leather satchel that looked heavier than the man himself. They went upstairs without words, and once in the chamber, he placed the satchel carefully on the floor before sitting. His shoulders seemed drawn up as though to make himself smaller. "Too many eyes in the hall today," he said at last. "Too many tongues, too." She poured water into the cup and slid it toward him. "There are fewer here," she said, and let the silence grow comfortable between them. After a while, he began to talk. Not about guild matters directly, but about the endless meetings, the tallying of goods, the disputes over rights to this street or that dockside warehouse. It was the talk of someone who carried more than was his to bear, and who needed, for a little while, to set it down without fear. She listened, asked nothing, and let him unwind his day like thread from a spool. When he left, the satchel was still with him, but his shoulders sat lower, and he thanked her as though she had given him something solid. Returning downstairs, she found the tavern denser now, the air carrying a warmth that came as much from bodies as from the hearth. A trio of women from the dye works had arrived, their laughter sharp enough to cut through the general hum. They took a table near the wall, their skirts brushing the rushes, and began sorting through a small pouch of coins with the precision of accountants. From the way they leaned in, it was not only drink they sought tonight, but information. The peddler, still in his corner, watched them as he might watch a market stall. She wondered whether his interest was in their coin or their words, but she passed him without comment, carrying ale to a pair of sailors who had only just come in from the docks. Their coats smelled faintly of tar, their hands still rough from the ropes. They spoke in a dialect from the western coast, their words curling like smoke, but the tone was clear enough. They were glad to be on land, and gladder still for a full cup. Agnes caught her eye from across the room and gave a slight tilt of her head, a signal that someone had asked for her. By the door a figure waited, not moving, his face mostly hidden in the shadow of his hood. When she approached, he lifted it just enough for her to see the sharp line of his jaw and the glint of a scar near his temple. "I was told you keep things safe," he said quietly. His voice was calm, but there was a weight in it. She studied him for a heartbeat, then nodded. "If they're worth keeping," she said. He reached into his cloak and withdrew a small object wrapped in dark cloth. She did not take it immediately. Instead, she led him toward the back stair, away from the gaze of the main room. In the chamber, he set it on the table but did not remove the cloth. "It's not gold," he said, "but it would buy more than a man might guess." She placed it in the chest without asking its story, just as she had done earlier in the evening for the man with the parcel. There was a kind of unspoken agreement in such moments. She did not know, and they did not tell, and the knowing or not knowing was worth the coin they left behind. When he was gone, she paused by the window for a moment. The lane below had shifted again. The jugglers were gone, replaced by a man playing a drum. the rhythm pulling in passersby like moths to a lantern. Across the way, a woman in a red scarf leaned from an upper window, speaking down to someone in the street in a voice too low for words to carry. A group of boys chased one another past, their shadows flickering like quick birds against the torchlit walls. Back in the tavern, the talk had grown louder, the air thicker with drink and the heat of too many bodies in a small space. She moved among them as if walking a shoreline, feeling the pull of each current but never letting it carry her too far. In the corner, the fiddler's bow drew out a slow, almost mournful tune, and for a moment, the whole room seemed to sway with it, even the laughter bending to its rhythm. Somewhere, in all of that warmth and noise, she felt the night beginning to lean toward its deepest hours. The hours when the city spoke in smaller voices, when its secrets came out more freely, and when the work she did was as much about listening as it was about anything else. The hour after midnight had its own texture, finer and quieter than the earlier bustle. The tavern was still full, but the edges of conversation had softened, voices blurring into one another like colors running in the rain. The fire burned low, throwing a steady red glow over the faces closest to it. Outside, the lane had thinned. Only the occasional bootstep or the rattle of a cart's wheel broke the stillness, and even those sounds seemed muted by the thick air of the night. She had taken a place near the back wall, not to rest entirely, but to watch. In these hours, people revealed themselves in smaller ways, a hand lingering on a cup, a laugh that came half a beat too late, the sudden glance toward the door. It was not yet closing time, but the pace had slowed to something more deliberate. The fiddler played a tune that seemed to fold in on itself, a looping rhythm that left listeners swaying unconsciously. A man at the far table caught her attention, not because of his voice, which was low and unremarkable, but because of his stillness. He was alone, nursing the same drink he had ordered more than an hour ago. His coat was plain, but his boots were of a quality that suggested he could afford better than the ale in front of him. She had seen him twice before, always arriving late, always leaving without a word. Tonight, when she passed his table, he looked up. "Is there a room for a short while?" he asked, his tone courteous but quiet enough that no one else would hear. "There is," she replied, and led him toward the back stair. In the chamber, she lit an extra candle. He did not sit until she had done so. He set a small purse on the table but did not open it. "I won't be here long," he said, "only long enough not to be seen somewhere else." She understood. There were many reasons for people to be where they were not expected, some harmless, others less so. She poured water and said nothing. He sat in the chair, looking at the candle's flame as though measuring the minutes by its movement. They spoke only once more, when he asked if the city always slept so heavily in the deep hours. "It sleeps," she said, "but it listens while it does." When he left, he took the purse with him, leaving a single coin on the table. She replaced the candle, closed the shutters halfway, and returned to the main room. The tavern had shifted again. Several tables were empty now, their occupants gone to bed or out into the quiet streets. The cooper, who had been loud earlier, now sat with his head bent toward the mason, their conversation little more than murmurs. The women from the dye works had left, their table cleared, but still carrying the faint scent of their trade. The peddler was gone too, his corner vacant for the first time that night. Agnes was behind the bar, counting the coins from the day's trade. She nodded toward the kitchen. "There's broth still warm," she said. "Better take it before it turns." In the kitchen, the hearth was quieter, the embers glowing faintly. She ladled the broth into a small bowl and sat at the work table, eating slowly. The warmth eased the ache in her shoulders, and for a while, she let herself listen to the sounds that seeped through from the tavern. A chair scraping, the soft murmur of voices, the steady bow of the fiddler. It was then that the apprentice from the apothecary appeared in the doorway, his hair slightly damp from the night air. "I nearly forgot," he said, pulling a folded scrap of parchment from his satchel. "A message. The man who gave it didn't wait for an answer." She took it, smoothing the creases. The writing was hurried but legible. A name she recognized, a place she knew, and a time that was not far off. No other words. She read it twice before folding it and tucking it into her sleeve. When she returned to the tavern, Most of the patrons were preparing to leave. A few lingered, reluctant to step into the cool street. She moved among them one last time, collecting cups, offering a final pour, making sure each left without feeling hurried. When the door closed behind the last of them, the room seemed suddenly larger. The fiddler set his bow aside and rubbed his hands together for warmth. Agnes began stacking the empty mugs. The younger girls swept the rushes, the soft swish of the brooms a gentle counterpoint to the settling creaks of the building. She helped gather the last of the plates, setting them in the kitchen to be washed in the morning. Only then, when the candles had been trimmed low and the fire reduced to embers, did she step out into the lane. The air was damp and cool, carrying the faint scent of the river. Above, the sky was deep and clear, the stars sharp against it. The street was nearly empty now, save for a watchman at the far end, his lantern swinging with each step. She stood for a moment, the quiet pressing in around her, and thought about the message in her sleeve, about the name and place and time it held. The night was almost over, but for her, the next day's work had already begun. The hour before dawn was neither night nor morning, but something in between, a liminal space where the city seemed to float in its own breath. The lane was hushed, its stones slick with the fine damp that gathered in the dark. She lingered outside only long enough to let the cool settle into her lungs before stepping back inside and bolting the door. The tavern smelled faintly of wood ash, and the day just passed, a mixture of bread crusts, ale, and the faint trace of perfume from a patron's coat. Upstairs, her chamber was as she had left it. She loosened the laces of her dress and draped it over the chair, pulled the pins from her hair, and rubbed her temples with slow, deliberate circles. Sleep came in patches for her, rarely in long stretches. Tonight she lay down only for a short while, the folded parchment still in her sleeve like a small weight against her arm. She did not remove it. Even in half dream, she wanted it close. When the thin light of early morning began to silver the edge of the shutters, she rose. Her feet found the cold floor, and she moved through the familiar ritual. Basin water over her face, hair smoothed and tied back, a plain shift drawn over her shoulders. She did not dress for the tavern yet. Today would begin beyond its walls. In the kitchen, Agnes was already at the hearth, the first loaf in the oven, steam curling up from the pot of oats. She glanced up, one brow raised. "Out early?" "There's an errand," she replied, reaching for a heel of bread and wrapping it in cloth. "I'll be back before the second bell." Agnes did not ask more. They both knew that some errands lived best without explanation. The streets were nearly empty as she set out, the stones damp underfoot. The message had named a place she knew well, a small square near the northern edge of the city where a stone fountain stood crooked from centuries of settling. The route there took her past shuttered shop fronts, their signs swaying faintly in the morning air. She passed a woman scrubbing her doorstep, a boy carrying a basket of kindling, and a man in a heavy cloak who nodded once without meeting her eyes. When she reached the square, the fountain's thin trickle was the only sound. She stood by its edge, her breath forming pale clouds, and waited. The time written in the message came and went by a few minutes before a figure appeared from one of the side streets. He was not unfamiliar. She had seen him once in the tavern, speaking briefly to the man with the dark coat who had left a parcel in her keeping. He approached without hurry, his hands clasped behind his back. "You received the note," he said, more a statement than a question. "I did." He glanced around the empty square, then reached into his coat and produced a small leather pouch. "For the man who left the black wrapped bundle. Give it to him when he returns. Tell him the other matter is settled." She took the pouch without opening it. "If he asks how I came by it, tell him it found its way by quiet hands." And with that, he turned and walked away, his boots leaving dark marks on the damp stone. She watched until he vanished into the narrow mouth of the lane, then slipped the pouch into the fold of her shawl. On the walk back, the city had begun to wake. Bakers were pulling the first trays of bread from their ovens, the smell curling into the streets. A fishmonger rolled open his stall, laying out the morning's catch on beds of wet rush. She stopped to buy a small bunch of thyme from a woman whose cart was piled with herbs, the stems still glistening from the morning dew. By the time she returned to the tavern, the first patrons of the day were arriving. Dock workers who preferred their morning drink before reporting to the quay, a man with a bundle of parchments under his arm, a washerwoman whose hands were raw from soap. Agnes was pouring ale, the younger girl sweeping the rushes. She slipped upstairs to her chamber, set the pouch in the chest beside the other man's bundle, and closed the lid. The sight of them together, one wrapped in black cloth, the other in plain leather, struck her with the quiet knowledge that the threads she held were beginning to tangle. There was no time to dwell. She changed into her work dress, laced the bodice, and went down to the tavern floor. The air was already warming with the scent of bread from the kitchen and the faint bite of early ale. She moved among the tables, setting down cups, collecting coins, catching fragments of conversation. A dispute over the price of salt, news of a merchant ship delayed by storms, the rumor of a magistrate's illness. By mid-morning, the sun pushed its way down the lane, catching the dust in the air and turning it gold. She carried the time to the kitchen, laying it on the table for Agnes, who glanced at it and gave a small approving nod. It was an ordinary gesture in an ordinary morning. Yet as she set the sprigs in a jar of water, she felt the shape of the day pressing in around her, carrying with it the quiet weight of the pouch upstairs and the certainty that whatever it contained was part of a story that had not yet begun to tell itself. The rest of the morning passed in a steady hum, the kind of rhythm that soothed without lulling. The tavern filled and emptied in waves. 2 sailors in for a quick cup before heading to the docks. A pair of women from the wool market exchanging gossip over trenchers of bread. An elderly man who sat by the hearth simply to warm his bones before moving on. She kept pace with it all. The carrying of mugs, the wiping of tables, the quiet exchange of coin for comfort. By the second bell, the street outside had grown lively. The lane's vendors called over one another in voices made hoarse by years of trade, hawking baskets of onions, bolts of cloth, and the small luxuries only a few could afford. From the open shutters came the mingled scents of roasted chestnuts, damp wool, and the faint tang of the river. She stepped outside for a moment, under the pretense of shaking the crumbs from a cloth, and let her eyes follow the movement of the crowd. Somewhere in that shifting stream of people, there might be someone watching for her, or someone watching for the man whose parcel sat in her chest. She could not tell which thought unsettled her more. A sharp laugh pulled her attention to the right, 2 boys chasing one another, weaving between the legs of a peddler who shouted after them half in jest. Beyond them, she caught a glimpse of a hooded figure leaning against the wall of the old cooper's shop, but when she looked again, he had vanished into the press of the street. Back inside, Agnes was speaking in low tones to a man in a green jerkin. He had the manner of someone who did not want to be recognized. His head bent, his voice kept to a whisper, even over the noise of the room. When Agnes noticed her watching, she lifted her chin slightly, a signal that the matter was not hers to tend. The rest of the midday was uneventful, save for a brief quarrel between 2 regulars over the dividing line between their cups of ale. She smoothed it with a jest and a refill, and soon enough, the argument dissolved into a shared complaint about the price of grain. In the kitchen, she helped Agnes prepare the day's stew, onions and carrots softened in fat, cuts of meat seared until brown, barley thickening the broth. As the pot simmered, the air filled with the deep, savory scent that always seemed to settle the room. It was a scent that marked time. By evening, it would seep into the rushes, into the beams, into the fabric of her dress, lingering long after the pot was emptied. Near the 3rd bell, the door opened to admit a man she had not seen before. He was plainly dressed, but carried himself with the upright ease of someone accustomed to command. His eyes swept the room without lingering, and when they reached her, he gave a small nod. She approached, expecting to offer him a seat, but instead he spoke quietly. "I'm looking for someone who was here 2 nights ago," he said. Tall, dark coat, scar near his temple. The description was exact enough that she needed no time to place it, but she did not let her pause show. "Many come through," she said evenly. "Some leave as quickly as they arrive." He studied her for a moment, as if weighing the truth in her voice, then inclined his head once more. "If he returns, Tell him the tide is turning sooner than expected." The words meant little to her, though they might mean a great deal to the man upstairs with the black-wrapped bundle. She gave no sign of recognition, only murmured that she would remember, and watched him leave. The rest of the afternoon felt sharper somehow, each face more distinct, each word caught more clearly. A pair of apprentices from the glassworks came in, their hair full of grit, and spoke of a fire in one of the northern kilns. A woman selling ribbons passed through, laying out her wares on a corner table before moving on. The fiddler arrived earlier than usual, testing his strings with the slow patience of one who never hurried the music. When the first shadows lengthened across the floor, she climbed the stairs to her chamber. She opened the chest and looked at the two objects inside, the black-wrapped bundle and the leather pouch, and thought of the man in the green jerkin, the stranger's warning, and the vanished figure in the street. She closed the lid gently. The chest's contents had not changed in weight or number, yet they felt heavier, as if the air in the room had thickened around them. Downstairs, a burst of laughter reminded her that the evening's tide of patrons would soon arrive. She smoothed her dress, tied her hair back, and descended to meet it, carrying with her the sense that the threads she held were drawing tighter with each passing hour. The woman in the wet stone cloak followed her upstairs without another word, moving with the calm assurance of someone accustomed to crossing thresholds that were not her own. In the chamber, the woman waited until the door was shut before drawing a small bundle from beneath her cloak. It was wrapped in rough linen, the edges frayed, but the knot was careful and deliberate. "This," the woman said, placing it on the table, "belongs to the same hands that left you something else." Her voice was even, but it carried a faint rasp, as though she had spent the day speaking in low tones. She studied the bundle, but did not touch it. "The black cloth?" The woman gave a single nod. "Keep them together. He'll come for both. Tell him it was delivered without delay, and that the meeting will not happen in the city after all." The phrasing had the same careful construction as the earlier messages, carrying weight without revealing its source. She lifted the bundle at last, feeling its solid weight, and placed it in the chest beside the other. "You've not asked what it holds," the woman observed. "I keep things," she replied. I don't seem to satisfy her. She reached into her cloak and set a coin, not silver but a gold crown, on the table. "For your silence." It was more than generous. She left it lying where it was until the woman had gone, her steps soundless down the back stair. From the window, she caught a glimpse of the gray cloak disappearing into the crowd. The lane had grown busy again, lit now by torchlight and the glow of windows. The sound of the fiddler's music drifted up, mingling with laughter and the steady murmur of conversation. When she returned to the tavern floor, the air felt warmer, thicker. The cooper and his young companion were gone, replaced by a group of traveling players still in partial costume. Their painted faces were half faded from the day's performances, their hands restless as they told stories that folded into one another, each more outrageous than the last. Near the bar, the peddler sat with his cloth bag at his feet, watching the room with that same cat-like stillness. His gaze followed her as she crossed to deliver a cup of wine to the merchants at the corner table. Agnes moved past, leaning in just enough to murmur, "The woman, not local, steps too light, eyes too sharp, reminded me of the lot from the southern fairs." She didn't give her name. "Those sorts don't," Agnes replied, and was gone before more could be said. The night flowed on. She carried bread to the table of players, ale to a pair of dock workers speaking in a dialect thick with salt and wind. The fiddler played a tune with more sway to it now, and the younger serving girl clapped along in time as she passed between tables. Still, beneath the music and laughter, that undercurrent remained, a subtle pressure in the air, as though the walls themselves were listening. By the time the third bell passed, the crowd had thinned. The players left in a burst of color and noise, the dock workers followed, and the peddler slipped out without ceremony. The room grew quieter, the shadows longer. It was then that the man in the green jerkin returned, the same who had spoken to Agnes in low tones the previous day. He approached her directly, glancing toward the back chamber. "Is it here?" he asked. "Both are." He seemed relieved, though his eyes still flicked toward the door as if expecting someone. Keep them safe. There are more eyes in this quarter now than there should be. He'll send for them soon. Soon when? When the river runs high, he said, as though that explained everything. Then he pressed a coin into her hand and left without another word. She watched the door swing shut behind him. The gold coin from the woman upstairs was still in her pocket, warm against her palm, and the two bundles upstairs rested side by side in the chest. The pieces were gathering, not yet joined, but circling each other, and she, as keeper, could feel the moment approaching when someone would come to bind them together. The following morning broke under a pale sky, the kind that gave no promise of sun, but carried a sharp clarity in the air. The lane outside was damp from a night's thin rain, the cobblestones slick and dark. She rose earlier than usual, the restlessness in her chest refusing to let her linger in bed. The chest at the foot of the bed seemed almost to hum with its own quiet weight. She washed quickly, dressed in her plainest shift, and pulled a shawl tight around her shoulders before heading downstairs. Agnes was already in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, bread dough under her hands. "You're up before the bell," she remarked without looking up. "There's a feeling in the air," she said, "like the city's listening." Agnes snorted softly. "The city always listens. It's just that some mornings you hear it listening back." She took a small heel of bread and a cup of watered ale and stepped outside, letting the cool air press against her face. The market quarter was just beginning to stir. A cart loaded with onions rattled past, the driver hunching under his hood. Farther down, a woman spread out bolts of cloth under an awning, the fabric bright against the gray morning. She had not gone far when she saw him, the man with the scar near his temple, moving at an unhurried pace along the opposite side of the lane. He did not look toward her, but she knew he had seen her. He turned into a narrow cut between two buildings without breaking stride. Something in his manner drew her after him, though she kept her distance. The cut opened into a small courtyard where the rainwater had pooled, reflecting the dull sky. He stood near an old stone well, speaking to a man she did not recognize. Tall, wrapped in a heavy brown cloak, his face half hidden in the shadow of the hood. They spoke too quietly for her to catch the words, but their stances told enough. This was no chance meeting. After a moment, the man in brown passed something small into the scarred man's hand, and the two parted without ceremony. The scarred man turned back toward the lane, his gaze sweeping the courtyard once before he left. She remained in the shadow of the arch until his footsteps faded. When she returned to the tavern, the first patrons had already taken their seats. She moved among them with practiced ease, though her mind kept drifting upstairs to the chest and the two bundles it held. By mid-morning, the dock workers had gone, replaced by a trio of clerks from the guild hall. They carried ledgers under their arms and argued amiably about figures as they drank. One of them, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, asked if she had heard anything about the magistrate's health. "If he's truly taken ill," he said, "there'll be changes in the court, and changes have a way of rippling out." She only smiled and shook her head. In truth, she had heard nothing, but the remark stayed with her. Near the second bell, a small boy arrived, no more than 10, his hair damp from the rain. He handed her a folded scrap of parchment, the writing cramped and hurried. "Be ready by nightfall. The river is already rising." There was no signature. She burned the paper in the kitchen hearth, watching the edges curl and blacken until nothing remained but ash. Agnes said nothing, only set another loaf on the table to cool. The rest of the day passed in a strange dual rhythm, the outward normalcy of the tavern's business and the steady tightening of something unseen. She fetched ale for the sailors who came in from the docks, ladled stew for a pair of traveling potters, listened to the fiddler tune his strings. And all the while, she felt the clock in her mind moving toward nightfall. When the shadows lengthened across the floor, she went upstairs. She opened the chest and looked at the bundles, the black cloth, the rough linen, resting side by side like two halves of a whole. She wrapped them together in her shawl, knotting the ends tightly. Downstairs, the tavern was beginning to swell with the early evening crowd. She told Agnes she would be gone for a short while, and Agnes, without asking, simply nodded. Mind the corners, she said. The lane outside glowed with torchlight, the air smelling of damp stone and wood smoke. She turned toward the river, the shawl heavy in her arms, and felt the pull of the current long before she saw the water itself. The river lay under a thin veil of mist, its surface shifting in slow, heavy swells. The rain from the hills had begun to feed it, and she could hear the stronger push of water against the pilings beneath the docks. Lanterns swung on their hooks, casting long, trembling paths of light over the dark water. She kept to the quieter edge of the quay, away from the cargo cranes and the shouting of men loading late shipments. Here, the air was cooler, carrying the sharp scent of wet rope and tar. The bundles in her shawl pressed warm against her side, their weight oddly steady despite the motion of her steps. Near the third mooring post, she saw him, the man with the scar. He stood with his back to the water, coat collar turned up, speaking to no one. When she approached, he glanced toward her without surprise. "You have them?" She loosened the knot in the shawl and set the bundles into his hands. He did not unwrap them, only checked their weight in a brief, practiced motion before tucking them beneath his coat. "The river will take me out before dawn," he said, his voice low enough that it was almost part of the mist. "Tell no one I was here. If you are asked, say you were home and that the night was quiet." "I've been told to say as much before," she replied. His mouth curved faintly, though whether in amusement or acknowledgement she could not tell. "Then you'll know how to keep it." They stood for a moment in the damp air, the lantern light swaying between them. Then he reached into his coat and drew out a small flat object wrapped in oilcloth. "For your keeping," he said, "until I return or until someone comes with my word." She accepted it without opening it. "And your word?" He looked toward the river. "It will be a phrase you'll not mistake. The tide was lower than we thought." With that, he stepped past her, moving toward the shadows between two warehouses. She watched until the mist swallowed him. The object in her hand was lighter than the bundles had been, yet it felt no less important. She tucked it deep beneath her cloak and began the walk back to the tavern, keeping to the less traveled lanes. Twice she thought she heard footsteps behind her, but each time she paused, the street lay empty. When she reached the tavern, the noise inside was a sudden, almost jarring warmth. The fiddler was playing a lively reel, and a table of masons clapped along, their boots striking the rushes. Agnes was carrying a tray of mugs toward the sailors by the window, her expression unreadable as she caught sight of her returning. She slipped upstairs without speaking. In her chamber, she placed the oilcloth-wrapped object in the chest and closed the lid. The absence of the two bundles made the space inside feel oddly hollow, though the new parcel seemed to fill it in a different way. Downstairs, she returned to her work as if nothing had changed, pouring ale, collecting coins, answering small questions about the stew. Yet all the while she carried the feel of the damp quay in her skin, the smell of the river in her hair, and the knowledge that something had shifted in the quiet handover beneath the swinging lanterns. It was near midnight when a small commotion rose near the door. A watchman had entered, shaking the rain from his cloak, his eyes scanning the room with slow precision. He spoke briefly to Agnes, who pointed toward the back wall. The watchman came to her table, resting his gauntleted hand on the wood. "A man matching your description was seen near the northern quay tonight," he said. "Scar by the temple. Did you see him?" She met his gaze evenly. "No. The night was quiet." He studied her face for a moment, then nodded and stepped back. "If you do, tell him the river's running faster than he knows." The words were close enough to the phrase she had been given that a faint chill passed through her. She did not let it show. When the watchman left, she turned back to the half-empty mugs on the table, her hands steady, though her mind was already moving toward the chest upstairs and the small, wrapped object waiting in the dark. The tavern thinned in the hours after the watchman's visit, as if his presence had unsettled the air. Patrons left in twos and threes, some casting glances over their shoulders before stepping into the lane. By the time the last mug was emptied and the final embers in the hearth dimmed to a faint glow, only Agnes, the fiddler, and she remained. They moved through the familiar ritual of closing. Candles pinched out one by one, rushes swept into the bin by the door, the smell of smoke and ale settling into the walls for another night. Agnes kept her eyes on her work, though once as she passed, she murmured, "A watchman in this quarter at that hour isn't looking for thieves. He's looking for whispers." Upstairs, in the small quiet of her chamber, she unlatched the chest. The oilcloth-wrapped object lay where she had placed it, its surface cool under her fingers. She resisted the temptation to loosen the knots, not out of fear of what it might contain, but because the act of keeping it sealed felt like the last line between her and whatever currents it was caught in. She set it back inside, closed the lid, and slid the small iron latch into place. Outside, the lane was still, save for the drip of water from the eaves. She undressed slowly, folded her dress over the chair, and lay down, her mind restless but her body sinking into the mattress. Sleep came in fragments. Once, she woke to the faint sound of footsteps outside her window, unhurried but deliberate. When she looked out, there was nothing, only the pale light of the moon on the cobblestones. Dawn was a thin wash of gray when she rose. The tavern smelled of yesterday's fire, its embers long cold. She lit the hearth, coaxing the flames to life, and set a pot of water to warm. Agnes joined her soon after, her hair bound up, her hands already dusted with flour. The first patron of the morning was a man she had never seen before, tall, with a weathered face and the posture of someone accustomed to sleeping in fields. He ordered only bread and water, then sat near the door as if waiting. His eyes wandered the room, but every so often they came back to her. When she brought his bread, he leaned in slightly. "There's a saying making its way through the docks," he said. "The tide was lower than we thought." The phrase rang through her like the toll of a bell. She studied him in silence, noting the worn edges of his coat, the mud on his boots, the faint scent of river water that clung to him. "I was told to give this if you answered," he continued, sliding a folded scrap of parchment beneath the plate. "No name, no return expected." She carried the plate back to the bar before unfolding the note. The handwriting was familiar, the same hand that had written the earlier messages. "Bring the parcel to the southern bridge at the 4th bell." Alone. The note burned easily in the kitchen fire, curling into black fragments that drifted upward with the heat. She spent the day moving through her work as though nothing had changed, though each moment felt marked by the ticking of an unseen clock. The tavern was busier than usual, merchants lingering over ale, apprentices running errands between shops, a handful of sailors speaking of a vessel that had run aground upriver. When the 3rd bell sounded, she went upstairs. The oilcloth-wrapped object felt heavier than it had before, as if it had drawn in the weight of all the hours since she received it. She tucked it deep into the folds of her cloak, fastened the clasp at her throat, and stepped into the lane. The walk to the southern bridge took her along streets that grew quieter with each turn. By the time the river came into view, the noise of the market had faded behind her. The bridge arched low over the water, its stone slick from the night's rain. A single figure stood at its midpoint, leaning on the parapet. He did not turn as she approached, but his voice carried easily over the water's murmur. "You've kept it well." She set the parcel between them on the stone. "It's yours?" "It belongs to more than me," he said. He reached for it, and in the same moment, from the shadow of the bridge's far end, another pair of footsteps began to approach. The sound of the approaching steps was measured, deliberate, carrying across the damp stones with a clarity that belonged to someone who wanted to be heard. The man beside her straightened, one hand resting lightly on the parcel, but not yet taking it. From the gloom under the bridge's far arch emerged a second figure, shorter, cloaked in deep brown, the hood drawn low enough to shadow the face. The water lapped softly below, a rhythm beneath the stillness between the three of them. "You're late," the newcomer said, the voice neither harsh nor warm, but edged with the kind of patience that frays easily. "The river slowed me," the man replied, "and I didn't expect to be met here." "This wasn't meant for your hands alone." The newcomer's gaze slid briefly toward her. "And you brought her." "I keep what's given," she said evenly. That seemed to halt whatever reply had been forming. The brown-cloaked figure moved closer, the torchlight from the lane catching the curve of a mouth set in thought. "Do you know what you've been holding?" She shook her head. "I wasn't asked to know." A faint sound escaped the figure, something between a laugh and a sigh. Then you've done better than most who think they can keep secrets. The man with the scar finally lifted the parcel from the parapet, holding it between his hands as though weighing it for the first time. The tide's turning faster than we planned, he said to the other. If this leaves the city tonight, it won't come back. That's the point. A brief silence settled, filled only by the low rush of the river. She sensed that whatever exchange was about to happen, her part in it was ending. She took a step back, but the brown cloaked figure stopped her with a glance. You've been seen keeping things safe, they said. That skill doesn't go unnoticed. There may be more to hold before this is done. The man with the scar gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind one gives when leaving a place they don't expect to return to soon. Then he turned, walking toward the far end of the bridge. The brown cloaked figure followed, the two of them vanishing into the mist beyond the reach of the torches. For a while, she stood alone at the bridge's midpoint, the damp seeping through the soles of her shoes, the air carrying the faint metallic scent of the swollen river. When at last she turned back toward the tavern, the lane felt different under her feet, as though she had crossed some border, invisible yet absolute. By the time she reached the door, the night was in full voice. Laughter spilled from the open shutters, mingling with the fiddler's tune and the clatter of mugs against wood. Agnes looked up from behind the bar as she entered, her eyes narrowing in silent question. It's gone, she said simply. Agnes's brow furrowed, but she nodded. Then the keeping's done, for now. She moved among the tables, refilling cups, fetching bread, listening to the small dramas of the evening. A mason boasting of a job nearly finished, a seamstress fretting over an order too large for her hands alone, a traveler from the east speaking of roads washed out by the rains. The familiar motion steadied her, though the damp weight of the bridge still clung to her thoughts. Much later, when the tavern had emptied to its last few patrons, she stepped outside for air. The lane was slick again with mist, the torches casting their halos into the fog. Somewhere far off, a bell marked the late hour. She leaned against the doorway, looking toward the bend where the lane curved out of sight. No one came. Yet the echo of those deliberate footsteps on the bridge lingered in her ears, and she knew the sound would follow her into sleep. The next morning unfolded with an almost deceptive calm, as though the city itself wished to smooth over the ripples of the night before. The rain had lifted, leaving the air clear and sharp, and the early sun painted the lane in pale gold. She rose without hesitation, her sleep having been shallow and broken, and moved through the familiar motions, washing at the basin, lacing her dress, tying her hair back with a strip of linen. The chest at the foot of her bed was empty now, save for the faint scent of lavender that clung to its wood from the sprigs she had kept there. She ran her fingers lightly over the bottom, feeling the cool grain beneath her touch. The space seemed too large without the weight it had held, and for a moment she wondered if it was relief or unease that filled her in its place. Downstairs, Agnes was already busy at the hearth, the smell of fresh bread mingling with the sharper tang of boiled chicory. "You're up early again," she remarked, her tone making it more statement than question. "Couldn't sleep." Agnes gave a short hum of acknowledgement, setting a tray of mugs onto the bar. "It'll be a steady morning. Word is a caravan's come in from the southern road. Merchants don't travel light, and they don't drink lightly either. The first of them arrived not long after. A pair of traders in worn cloaks, their packs still dusted from the road. They took seats near the window, ordering ale and small plates of bread and cheese. Their talk was low but animated, full of place names and market prices. She listened without appearing to, storing away the mention of shortages in the hill towns and rumors of a tax increase on imported grain. As the morning wore on, the tavern filled in the way it often did on market days. Bursts of noise and movement, followed by lulls in which only the scrape of chairs and the murmur of quiet conversations filled the air. She moved between tables, the rhythm steady, until a shadow fell across the doorway. It was the peddler, the same man who had spent so many evenings in the far corner, his eyes following the room more than his goods. Today he carried no pack at all. He walked directly to her and said in a voice low enough for only her to hear, "They'll be wanting another safe place before the week's end. Not here. Too many eyes now." Her hands stilled on the tray. "I thought it was finished." "Finished for now," he said, and his mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile if it had reached his eyes. "But currents shift. You've been useful." Before she could reply, he placed a small coin on the bar, not payment so much as a marker, and left without looking back. The rest of the day passed with the kind of surface normalcy that made the undercurrents harder to ignore. Merchants came and went, a group of carpenters argued over tools, and the fiddler arrived early, claiming he'd been chased indoors by a sudden gust off the river. Yet through it all, she felt a faint, unshakable awareness that the quiet would not last. By late afternoon, the light had thinned to that soft, uncertain glow that hinted at rain again. She stood by the window, wiping its edge with a cloth, and saw a man across the lane watching the tavern. He was dressed plainly, his stance unremarkable, but he did not look away when her eyes met his. Instead, he tipped his head slightly, as though to mark her recognition, and then turned down the alley beside the cooper's shop. She stayed at the window a moment longer, the cloth idle in her hand. The street had already swallowed him, but the gesture lingered. Not a summons, not a warning, but an acknowledgement that whatever lay ahead had already begun moving toward her. When she turned back to the room, Agnes was watching her from behind the bar. "Someone you know?" "Not yet," she said. Agnes's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing more. The fire in the hearth popped, a chair scraped across the floor, and the life of the tavern flowed on, carrying her with it, steady on the surface, with the pull of deeper waters below. The rain came back in the night, first as a soft patter on the shutters, then as a steady drumming that filled the small hours. By morning, the lane glistened under a low, unbroken sky, the stones dark and slick. She rose slowly, her limbs heavy from the restless sleep that had become all too common. The memory of the man who had watched her from across the lane lingered, as if his gaze had left a mark she could not quite name. The tavern smelled of damp wool and the smoke Agnes had coaxed from a stubborn hearth. Bread was already baking, its crust darkening in the oven, and a pot of onion broth simmered, filling the air with its sharp, sweet scent. Agnes glanced at her as she entered. "Market's half empty today. The rain keeps the soft-footed indoors, but the ones who come out will stay longer to dry themselves." She nodded, pulling on a plain apron. "And drink longer," she added, earning a brief smile from Agnes. The first patrons were a pair of boatmen, their coats soaked through, leaving small puddles on the floor beneath their chairs. They spoke of the river with the intimacy of men who measured their days by its moods, how the current had picked up since last week, how the banks beyond the mill had begun to crumble. One of them leaned closer, lowering his voice. "And there's talk of a body pulled from the water near the South Bend, no name given, no one asking too loudly." She served them without comment, but the words settled into her mind like stones. By mid-morning, the rain had eased, but the sky remained heavy. A few merchants arrived, shaking the wet from their cloaks, followed by two women from the dye works, their hands stained deep blue. The fiddler was already in his corner, tuning a new string, claiming the damp had warped the old one. She was carrying a tray of mugs when the door opened to admit the man from the previous day, the one who had watched from across the lane. He stepped inside as if the room belonged to him, though his coat and boots marked him as someone who walked farther than this quarter alone. He took a seat near the wall and waited, his eyes never leaving her. When she approached, he spoke in a voice meant for her alone. "I was told you can keep something for a short while. That depends on the something." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded scrap of thick parchment, sealed with dark wax. The seal bore no crest, only an unfamiliar mark, a small curved line that could have been a wave or a blade or neither. "Not long," he said. "It will be claimed within 3 days. It must remain unopened." She accepted it, feeling the faint texture of the seal beneath her thumb. "And if it's not claimed, then you'll burn it." He left a coin on the table, heavy, silver, older than most she saw in circulation, and rose without finishing the drink she had set down for him. He was gone before she could glance back from the bar. Upstairs, in her chamber, She placed the sealed parchment in the chest. Its presence felt different from the others she had kept, lighter in weight but edged with a kind of quiet pressure. The dark wax seemed to hold not only the paper, but the space around it, as if it would resist any attempt to breach it before its time. When she returned to the tavern, the air was louder, filled with the voices of patrons who had decided to ride out the rain indoors. The boatmen were still in their seats, joined now by a young scribe who looked as though he had wandered in by accident. The dye workers were arguing over a delivery gone missing, and the fiddler had shifted to a tune with a sharper, quicker step. She worked through the afternoon without pause, though every so often her mind flickered back to the chest upstairs. She wondered who would come for the sealed parchment and whether they would be alone. Near sunset, the rain began again, heavier this time, beating against the shutters in waves. The lane outside blurred into glistening shapes, torchlight bending in the puddles. Inside, the tavern's warmth thickened, drawing in those who had no wish to face the storm. It was then that the peddler appeared in the doorway, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He took his old seat in the corner, but instead of laying out goods, he leaned forward, elbows on the table, and motioned for her. When she came close, he spoke in the same low tone he always used for words that mattered. "You've taken something today. Keep it close. There are more than 2 sets of hands looking to claim it." She did not ask how he knew. Some knowledge in this city moved like the river, always flowing, always carrying more than the eye could see. The rain deepened into night, turning the lane into a narrow stream of running water. The tavern's shutters rattled softly under the wind, but the fire inside held the room in its warm grip. Patrons lingered longer than usual, their conversations weaving together in a low, constant hum. She kept moving, refilling mugs, laying out bread, pausing now and again to catch pieces of talk that slipped between the clink of pewter and the hiss of logs on the hearth. A merchant by the window spoke of wagons stuck in the mud outside the city gates. A pair of dock hands muttered about the watch doubling its patrols along the quay. The fiddler's bow wandered into a slower tune, as if the weather itself had settled into the strings. The peddler in the corner drank sparingly, his eyes moving more than his hands. From time to time, he glanced toward the door as though expecting someone who might never arrive. When she passed him with an empty tray, he murmured, "The man who left you the parchment, he won't be the one to take it back. But when they come, they'll speak as though they already own it." She met his gaze briefly, but did not answer. Some warnings were better carried in silence, like a lantern shielded from the wind. Near the second bell of the night, a stranger entered. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a heavy travel cloak darkened by rain. He paused just inside, letting the warmth and light fall over him, then stepped to the bar. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but certain. "I'm looking for a place to leave something until the road's clear." Agnes glanced toward her without a word. She crossed to the man, noting the way his boots left small puddles on the rushes. "What is it?" He produced a small wooden box, no larger than a folded hand, bound shut with twine. 2 days, he said, no more. Keep it from the damp and keep it from curious eyes. She took it without promise beyond a nod. If it's not claimed, then it goes to the river. When he left, the door closing softly behind him, she carried the box upstairs. The chest at the foot of her bed now held 2 things, the sealed parchment with its dark wax and this small twine-bound box. They sat apart, like 2 quiet guests who had never been introduced. She stood for a moment, listening to the muted sound of rain against the shutters, before latching the chest again and returning to the tavern. The room had grown louder in her absence, the dock hands now singing a rough chorus in time with the fiddlers playing. The peddler was gone, replaced by a pair of weavers whose stained hands curled around mugs of ale. Agnes moved between tables with her usual steady pace, her eyes briefly meeting hers as she passed. A wordless acknowledgement that the night's work was heavier than the cups they carried. It was past the 3rd bell when another figure appeared in the doorway, shaking the wet from a gray cloak. This one moved without hesitation, scanning the room only once before approaching her. "You've something for me," the cloaked figure said, voice low and even. "Sealed with dark wax. It's mine." Her mind moved quickly, The peddler's warning, the stranger's certainty, the absence of any password or phrase. She let her hands rest lightly on the edge of the tray she carried. Many come asking for things. Some are theirs, some are not. The figure's mouth curved faintly, but the eyes remained unreadable. Then perhaps you should decide carefully. I'd hate for someone else to collect what belongs to me. Without waiting for her answer, the figure stepped back toward the door, as if to remind her they could leave just as easily as they had arrived. She watched them go, the door swinging shut against the wind, and felt the weight of the two objects upstairs like stones in the chest, one sealed in wax, one bound in twine, both now drawing attention from more than the hands that had placed them there. The wind pressed against the shutters all through the night, making them tremble like thin bones. Even after the tavern emptied and the fire sank into red embers, she found herself listening for footsteps in the lane, half expecting the gray cloak to return. Sleep came only in shallow stretches. She woke once to the faint creak of the signboard outside swaying in the gusts, again to the distant bark of a dog, and once more to the echo of her own name in a dream. When at last the sky began to pale, she rose, moving quietly so as not to disturb the stillness of the upper floor. The chest waited at the foot of her bed, as it always did, but now it seemed more like a crossroads than a simple piece of furniture. She opened it, her fingers resting on the sealed parchment, then on the twine-bound box. Both were cold to the touch. She closed the lid again, sliding the latch into place with a small, final click. Downstairs, the air carried the sharp scent of chicory from the pot Agnes had set on the hearth. A loaf of bread was cooling on the table, steam still curling from its crust. Agnes gave her a long, measuring look over the rim of her cup. "Something's pulling at the threads," she said. "I can feel it. Just mind you're not the knot they cut first." She said nothing, only poured herself a cup and let the bitter warmth settle in her chest. The first patron was a watchman off duty, his cloak slung over one shoulder. He took a place near the fire and ordered nothing more than bread and broth, staring into the flames as though hoping they might burn away the night's memories. When she set the bowl before him, he glanced up and said, almost idly, "There's been a rise in questions about who holds what in this quarter. People listening at doorways, asking the wrong folk in the right way. You do well to keep your shutters barred." By mid-morning, the lane outside had dried in patches, sunlight breaking through the cloud cover in narrow beams. A merchant with a cart of dyed silks stopped in for ale, his bright bolt spilling color into the shadowed room. Two apprentices from the smithy came in next, their talk loud enough to fill the corners, but she heard little of it, her attention caught by a small scrap of parchment that had been slid under the door. It bore no seal, no signature, only a few words written in a cramped hand. "At dusk, the western steps." She slipped it into her sleeve and went about her work, but every movement felt tuned to the slow turning of the day toward evening. The fiddler arrived earlier than usual, his case under his arm, and began a soft, steady tune that seemed to stretch the hours thin. When the sun dipped low and the lamps in the lane began to flare, she climbed the stairs to her chamber. The chest opened under her hands, revealing its two silent guests. She took the sealed parchment, wrapping it in her shawl, and left the box untouched. Agnes was wiping down the bar when she passed, but said nothing, only gave the smallest nod, a gesture that could have meant caution or farewell or both. The western steps were a worn set of stone leading from the lane down toward the river's edge, tucked between two leaning warehouses. She found them empty, the damp air carrying the faint smell of tar and fish. The sound of the water was closer here, louder against the pilings. She waited only a few moments before a figure emerged from the shadow, not the gray cloak, nor the man with the scar, but someone entirely new. This one was young, with a narrow face and the quick, sharp movements of a bird. "You've kept it," he said without greeting. "I have." He held out a hand, but before she could pass the parcel over, another sound rose from the top of the steps. Heavier footsteps, deliberate, closing in. She turned and a second figure appeared in the torchlight, blocking the way back to the lane. The newcomer at the top of the steps was taller, broader, his face half hidden beneath the brim of a hat beaded with rain. The torchlight caught the outline of a jaw set tight and the gleam of a hand resting on the hilt of a knife. The young man beside her stiffened but didn't move away. "I came for it," he said, his voice quickening. "It's mine by right." The tall figure's voice carried over the steps, slow and unyielding. "Yours, boy? Or did someone send you thinking you'd be quick enough to vanish before the wrong eyes saw you?" The young man's jaw worked, but he didn't answer. She kept her hand on the shawl that wrapped the sealed parchment, feeling its edges beneath the fabric. "If it's meant for you," she said to the boy, "then you'll know what was told to me when it was left." His eyes darted to hers, searching, but whatever he hoped to find wasn't there. He said nothing. The tall man began descending the steps, each footfall deliberate, echoing against the stone. "I'll take it," he said, "and I'll give you something for the trouble, more than the one who left it ever promised." She stepped back until her heels met the damp wall, keeping both of them in view. The wind off the river tugged at her skirts, carrying the smell of brine and wet wood. "It wasn't left for the highest coin," she said. "That's where you're wrong," the tall man replied. "Everything in this city is." The boy moved then, quick as a shadow, trying to slip between her and the man. She shifted, blocking him with a turn of her shoulder. The tall man's hand left the knife hilt, not in retreat, but to reach into his coat. He pulled out a small folded scrap and held it where she could see. It was a piece of parchment marked with the same curved line as the seal upstairs, a wave or a blade. The same mark that had been pressed into the wax of the letter in her chest. "You know what this means," he said. She did. Without speaking, she loosened the knot in her shawl and drew out the sealed parchment. The boy made a sound, sharp and frustrated, but didn't try again to take it. She set it into the tall man's waiting hand. He examined the seal briefly, then tucked it away inside his coat. "Wise choice," he said, and turned to climb the steps. When he reached the top, he glanced back once. "Keep your door bolted these next nights. Some won't take kindly to finding the current has already shifted." He disappeared into the lane. The boy lingered only long enough to throw her a look that was part anger, part grudging respect, before melting into the shadows by the river. She stood for a moment longer, listening to the water. The air seemed colder now, as if the exchange had carried some of its warmth away with it. By the time she returned to the tavern, the room was quieter, the evening crowd thinned to a few late lingerers. Agnes glanced up from the bar, her eyes asking a question she didn't voice. "It's gone," she said simply, unwinding the empty shawl. Agnes studied her for a heartbeat, then turned back to her work. "Then let's hope whatever's left is lighter to carry." Upstairs, she opened the chest. The small twine-bound box sat alone now, the only thing left to keep. She closed the lid softly, though the echo of the tall man's warning lingered in her ears, and with it the knowledge that this last parcel might yet bring someone else to her door before the week was done. The last days of that week unfolded in a strange, taut quiet, like the air before a storm. The tavern's usual rhythms continued. Mugs filled and emptied, bread broken and shared, the fiddler's bow tracing tunes both quick and slow. Yet she felt each moment pulled forward by the weight of what still lay upstairs. The twine-bound box had become an unspoken presence. She checked it each morning, not because she feared it gone, but to assure herself it remained exactly as it had been left. The twine dry, the wood cool, no mark or scratch that hadn't been there before. And still, no one came for it. On the fourth day, a woman arrived just as the lamps in the lane were being lit. She wore a cloak the color of burnt umber, its hood deep enough to shadow her features. She took a seat near the back, where the wall curved toward the stair, and waited without ordering. When she rose and approached, her steps were silent on the rushes. "You've been keeping something," she said, her voice low and even, small, bound in twine. Her hand slipped inside her cloak, emerging with a thin strip of parchment no longer than a finger. She held it out. The writing was brief, only the phrase, "The river runs backward at dawn." The words meant nothing to her, but the manner in which they were given and the certainty in the woman's tone left no doubt that they were meant as a key. Without comment, she led the woman upstairs to her chamber. The box sat alone in the chest. She lifted it, feeling again its surprising weight for its size, and placed it in the woman's hands. No questions, no delay. The woman neither opened it nor glanced inside. She simply drew the cloak tighter around herself. It's better you didn't see, she said, almost kindly. Then she pressed a single gold coin into her palm, lighter than the crown the gray-cloaked visitor had given, yet still heavy enough to mark its value, and left without another word. From the window, she watched the woman disappear into the deepening dusk, turning toward the quay. The fog off the water had begun to curl between the buildings, blurring the torches along the lane. When she returned downstairs, Agnes was stacking clean mugs behind the bar. "It's gone?" she asked without looking up. "It's gone." "Good. That chest of yours will sleep easier." She smiled faintly at that, though she knew the chest was never truly empty. There was always something to hold, whether in wood and twine or in words unsaid. The tavern filled again that night, voices rising over the hiss of the hearth and the patter of rain returning against the shutters. The peddler was back in his corner, though tonight he laid out no wares, only sat watching with the calm of someone who knew the pattern of things. The fiddler's tune wound slowly through the room, its notes carrying the kind of memory that lingered after the last chord faded. She moved through it all with her usual quiet pace, serving, listening, passing between tables like a shadow that knew its place. Yet beneath the surface, she felt the faint relief of threads released from her hands, and the knowledge that, for the first time in many days, nothing waited upstairs in the dark. Still, as the night thinned toward closing, she found herself glancing toward the door more than once, as though expecting some new shape to appear from the mist. In this city, after all, the work of keeping was never done. It only paused, waiting for the next thing that needed to be hidden, guarded, or simply held until the right hands came to claim it. The next morning began without rain, but the air still carried the cool damp of the river. Sunlight pushed through the clouds in pale shafts, glancing off the wet stones in the lane. She rose early, as had become her habit, and found herself standing over the chest at the foot of her bed. It was truly empty now, the bare save for a faint trace of lavender that clung to the wood like a memory. The emptiness felt strange, lighter in one way, yet almost unsettling in another, as though the room had lost a quiet heartbeat. She closed the lid gently and dressed for the day. Downstairs, Agnes was already at work, a pot of millet porridge thickening over the hearth. "No word for you yet?" she asked without looking up. "No," she said. "Then it will come soon, or all at once." Agnes's tone suggested she thought there was little difference between the two. The first hour of the morning was calm. A pair of carpenters came in for bread and ale before heading to the yard. A fishmonger stopped to warm his hands at the fire on his way back from the quay. Outside, the market square began to stir, the calls of early vendors carrying faintly through the shutters. She was clearing a table when the peddler appeared in the doorway. This time, he carried no bag, no bundle of goods. His eyes searched the room, found her, and he crossed to her with the measured pace of someone who knew there was no need to hurry. "You've done well," he said softly, "and you've been noticed for it." She set the tray down on the bar. "Noticed by whom?" He didn't answer directly. "There's a meeting tonight, in the upper room of the old granary near the east gate. You'll want to be there." "I wasn't invited." "You were. You just didn't hear it said out loud." Before she could press further, he was gone, leaving only the smell of damp wool and the faint creak of the door swinging shut. The day passed in its usual rhythm, merchants stopping in from the square, a pair of guild clerks taking a corner table to balance their accounts, the fiddler arriving earlier than usual and tuning in the quiet between customers. But beneath it all, she felt the steady pull of the hours toward the night. When evening came, she left the tavern to Agnes and the younger girls. The lane glowed in torchlight, the air cool against her face as she walked east. The old granary was a squat, weathered building, its upper floor reached by a narrow set of stairs worn smooth by years of use. Inside, the room was lit by a handful of candles set on a long table. Around it sat 6 people, none of whom she knew by name, though she recognized 2 from the quay and 1 from the market. The peddler was there as well, leaning back in his chair, watching her with an unreadable expression. A woman at the far end of the table spoke first. Her voice was low, but it carried easily. "We've all heard how you kept what was given to you, without question, without loss. That's why you're here. We have work that needs that kind of keeping." "What sort of work?" she asked. The woman's eyes glinted in the candlelight. "The kind where you might hold something for a night or a month or a year, never knowing if the one who left it will return. The kind where keeping it safe matters more than knowing why it's dangerous." She thought of the chest upstairs, of the sealed parchment, the black wrapped bundle, the twine-bound box. She thought of the faces that had come for them and the ones that had not. "And if I refuse?" The peddler leaned forward. "Then the work will find you anyway. Better to know you've chosen it than to have it arrive at your door unannounced." The candles flickered as a draft moved through the room. No one spoke until the woman at the end nodded toward her. "You'll be sent for when you're needed. Until then, keep your chest empty and your eyes open." When she stepped back into the night, the air felt sharper, the shadows deeper. The lane to the tavern seemed longer than usual, each footstep echoing as though marking the beginning of something she had not yet agreed to, but could no longer avoid.